Hello everyone and welcome to part 2 of my series of videos about vSphere with Tanzu on NSX-T. In this video I'm going to walk you through my vSphere environment and things you need to prepare to get started with vSphere on Tanzu. In the previous video I've walked through the configuration and preparation of NSX-T. In this video we'll look at the vSphere environment and we'll go through the workload management wizard and show you what you need to, as an example, what you can configure there and what is important to be aware of. So first of all, the environment is running vSphere 7.0.1c, so that's at this date the latest version, and NSX-T 3.1. As you can see in my environment, I have the edge nodes running on the compute cluster. So I have 4 hosts in the compute cluster and I've configured HA and DRS, which is required for vSphere with Tanzu. And as you can see, and I explained earlier, we have the compute NSX switch enabled for NSX and a standard vSwitch, which is only doing the management part and vMotion for this cluster. We go to the switch configuration in the VDS side. I just want to highlight it's a VDS 7 and we have configured the MTU of 9000 here to support NSX-T. I also prepared a management port group which is configured with VLAN 307, which is my management VLAN ID. This is where the supervisor cluster nodes are going to connect it to be able to communicate with my vCenter and NSX-T. And you can see also the port groups NSX has configured right now. And those are the port groups I've shown in the other segments, I should say, which I've configured in NSX-T to connect my edges to, which are trunk A and trunk B, and the segments being used by the tier 0. Furthermore, I have shared storage, NFS storage. And what you need to do is you need to create a tag and a tag category for this to work. So I assigned a tag. In this case, I assigned the tenzu tag, and I created a new tag category named tenzu in order to use them in a storage policy, which is a tag-based placement policy for the workloads being deployed in vSphere with Tanzu. That's something else I prepared. So let's move to the storage policies. So this is a VM storage policy. So I created a Tanzu VM storage policy. And this is basically saying everything when you want to deploy namespaces and pods and stuff. We want to have tag-based placement rules to make sure that those components are placed on the right storage. In my case, I only have one shared data store, but if you have different data stores with different gold, silver, or bronze kind of policies or profiles, you can do tag-based placement rules based on those data stores you want to share. So here I specify I want the tag category to be tenzu and the tags to be tenzu, and I can see I have one shared data store as a compatible storage, and that's it. So furthermore, you need to create a content. You need to subscribe to a content library. So I've configured a content library for Tanzu. Sorry. So here you can see how this is set up. This is also in the documentation, but this is the subscription URL, and I enabled the automatic synchronization, and I download all content immediately. And as you can see, it has done that already. So if we look at the templates part, we can see all the available images for our guest clusters if we want to deploy them in the future. So this will be used when we use TKG guest clusters on my vSphere Tanzu environment. So once this is done, we're ready, obviously with the right licenses, to enable the workload management part. So let's go through the workload management wizard. Obviously all the requirements are shared here. You can also download checklists, you can review documentation and review your content libraries and storage policies. So let's get started. In here, I select the vCenter. This is the default, I have only one. I select the NSX-T networking option. And now it will look for any compatible clusters. I have only one cluster, which is shown compatible. Then we'll select the control plane size. Well, in my lab, I'm choosing the tiny size, which is more than enough for this training and demo purposes. And now I am able to select the storage where I want the control plane, ephemeral disk and image cache to be on. So in my case, I only have my Tanzu storage policies, and this will make sure that all this stuff is going to be deployed on the related storage or data stores attached to that storage policies. Now it becomes a bit more interesting because now we need to configure the management network, and this is for the control plane and worker nodes being connected to each other. So first of all, I've configured this management port group, which is VLAN 307, and I need to have a starting IP address. And what's important to know, and it will also show you here, that you need at least 5 IP addresses. You need at least one for a cluster IP, and 3 for the supervisor control plane VMs, and 1 for a floating IP. And this is used to do a rolling upgrade in case when you're doing upgrades. In my case, I'm using 110.2.9.12.2.1.0 as my starting IP. And in my lab, I'm using /27 network. The gateway in my case is 10.2.9.12.2.2.2, 10.2.9.12.1.9.7. So this DNS server is also my domain controller and is on the same network for this management component. So I've made sure that for the 5 IP addresses, the consecutive IP addresses, I have them available in my network. So 210 through 214 are reserved for all the management IP addresses of the workload management of vSphere with Tanzu. I'm using this search domain, and the domain controller is in my case also an NTP server. So that's the management part done. Now we need to look for the workload network configuration. Before I'm going to show that, I want to show this diagram. So what's important to know is you obviously select a VDS and Edge cluster and your DNS, but the ranges you specify for your pod services and egress are very important. So I generally leave the pods and services the default ranges. Do note that you cannot change the services range anymore after you've configured this. You can only scale out or make ranges larger afterwards. So for pods, if you want them to be routable, you may want to have an IP range which is allowed to be routed through your network. And for ingress and egress, it's very important to note that the egress IP range is being used for source netting from your namespaces towards the external network. So each namespace will get an egress IP from this IP pool. And ingress IP addresses will be used for incoming traffic for service type load balancer or service type ingress on the vSphere with Tanzu environment. So each namespace gets at least an ingress IP from this range. So this range needs to be sufficient enough to have enough IP addresses for the amount of namespaces you are planning to use, as each namespace gets a tier 1 and each namespace gets a load balancer IP. Obviously, when you want to use, for example, Docker Hub on your internet and you're not having an air-gapped environment, you are able to, let's say, allow traffic from that egress IP to reach the internet, it's important you allow that routing, right? So then I'm able to download images, for example, from Docker Hub straight into vSphere and run the containers even without a image registry. And it will reach it through this egress IP range. And if you want to access, obviously, your applications you're planning to deploy in your workload management network, or workload network, sorry, it's important to be able to reach the ingress network. So make sure your physical network is learning those routes from the tier 0 and routing that through your environment towards your workstations. So with that knowledge, let's configure a VDS. So in my case, it's the compute VDS. Now it discovers the associated edge clusters. In my case, I only have one. And this will be the edge cluster where all the tier 1s will be automatically deployed on. In DNS, I configured an alias record, which is pointing to this fully qualified domain name, local. And I'm using the same DNS server. What's important to know is that this DNS should also be reachable from the networks you use for egress and ingress, and most specifically egress, because it will try to reach this DNS server. So be aware of that. Then I leave pod range the same as the defaults. This is enough for me. And for ingress, I'm using 192.168.121.0/24. It's more than sufficient for my environment. And 122.0/24 for egress. Next step is adding the content library I subscribe to. And then we have the opportunity to review the configuration and start enabling workload management on my compute cluster. So once I click finish, a lot of stuff will happen in your environment. You will see supervisor control planes being deployed, all kinds of actions happening, and you can monitor this page to see the configuration status. And this can take quite a while. In my lab, it takes 30 to 40 minutes, I believe. So be patient and keep an eye on this, and we'll come back to another video to show what's actually configured and how that does it look like in NSX-T as well, so you understand what's being initialized, if you like, for this to work. Another great tip is you can monitor if you need to troubleshoot the deployment of vSphere with Tanzu. You can troubleshoot by tailing the following log files. So var log vmware wcp svc.log. So if you tail this log file, you can see all the actions being done in enabling the workload management. And if there's an issue, you can discover it here. So that's a great tip for troubleshooting purposes. So this concludes part 2 of this series. So let's continue in part 3, reviewing what's actually configured and installed and how it's instantiated in NSX-T. Thank you for watching, and if you have any questions or feedback, please let me know. Thank you. Bye-bye.